Right. So, what's that? That look okay.
Okay, yeah, do that then. Because the problem is I just feel that some of the animations do not work on the. Anyway, send laptop to projector 1. And send laptop to projector 2. Or both. Yeah, what is it? You send it to the resolution. It's kind of weird that they're in different shapes. Well, it projects, so let's just leave it like that. Okay. Yeah, it is. So I've got it on my screen here, so that's fine. No, it's all good. Yeah, it's good. Wait, give me seconds, then we'll put it up. Wait, I just need to check. Just going to tweet out the link. Hold on. I'm posting online as me, not as the College of Europe. Yeah, I'm doing live streaming. I think less of the questions at the end, but I'm happy to take whatever questions. Yeah, I'll take it.
Excuse me, sorry, is it okay if I just... Sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm very glad today to welcome John Worth. I've met him when he was the president of an NGO called Young European Federalists. It still exists. And he has kindly agreed to come to speak to us, and I think it's a great favor he's giving us and you, as he's one of the 10 most read blogger on European Union politics. So please follow him, follow his blog, follow him on Twitter. You will learn as well that this session is actually being live streamed on YouTube or Twitter, you will explain. And just to say also that you're visiting professor at the College of Europe, and the floor is yours.
Right, thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So, just to explain the live streaming, first of all, my mobile phone is here at the front and is streaming that onto YouTube. If, when we come to questions later on, you're not going to be on the film because it's only filming me, and if you don't want to say your name so it's not clear who the question is from, that's perfectly fine by me. The rest is therefore for anyone else who can then potentially then follow what comes up with this lecture. Just a quick introduction about how it's going to work. Everything I say is on the record, also because of the live stream. The slides can be reused for whatever purposes you wish. And if you want to follow up on anything I say and you don't have time to ask it after this lecture, probably the best way and means of reaching me is to tweet me about it. I work essentially somewhere in between everyday practical politics, consultancy, and academic teaching. So I'm not an academic in a classical sense. I don't have a PhD or any professor or lectureship position. I do, however, run courses predominantly for European Union politics masters students about digital communications in the European Union. I'm brought in to do the kind of practical sessions about how everyday politics works, and then academic colleagues explain the theory and the framework into which that fits. What I'm going to talk about today is essentially 3 points. Those are those up on the slide here. Why actually bother with digital communication in the European Union? Digital communication in a political system that finds it very hard to adapt to the changes that are brought about by that digital communication. And what are the European Union institutions actually doing on a practical, everyday basis? Are they trying to essentially communicate internally within the institutions as a kind of gossip channel, or are they actually trying to do mass public communication? I'm not based in the UK on an everyday basis. I am British, but I'm actually based in Berlin. Most of my clients are either in Berlin in German politics or in Brussels EU politics. I also, however, via social media, also have a view on what's happening in British politics, and particularly with regard to digital communications and Brexit. So bear in mind that therefore the examples that I will use today are going to be a mix of British, German, and particularly European Union examples, and certainly the kind of intellectual kind of framework for this lecture focuses on the European Union institutions in Brussels. I'm quite happy to answer questions at the end about any type of digital politics or any politics in general if you wish. So, the first question is, why actually bother with digital communication in the European Union? And I'm going to start with a quote from a vice president of the European Commission, Maroš Šefčovič, who you hear this sort of phrase from European Union institutions on a regular basis, this horrible phrase, bringing Europe closer to its citizens, i.e. the perceived problem with the European Union that the people, the 500 million European Union citizens, don't understand what it does, do not accept the legitimacy of European Union politics, and therefore it is the responsibility of the European Union institutions to somehow explain themselves to the European population. Right? Not in a kind of classic terms, right? The political future, as we will see, of someone like Maroš Šefčovič does not necessarily depend on his ability to communicate, but the general legitimacy of the European Union's institutions as a sum, as a whole, is somehow based on the idea that there needs to be legitimacy of the EU in the eyes of European people. But while quotes like this are very common from politicians in the European Union, the actual incentives those politicians have to really do good quality communication is actually pretty low. If you look at the way the European Union institutions behave and the incentives that the politicians have within those institutions, there's actually quite a strong incentive sometimes to not actually communicate, or not at least not communicate well. In the European Commission, the political futures of the commissioners do not depend on their ability to communicate, and indeed it might actually be quite the contrary, i.e. if you have an ability to communicate widely, that means you are perhaps harder to control as a politician. In the European Parliament is often for, I hope this phrase is familiar to you, Sarah can probably tell me if so, that European Parliament elections are second-order national elections, i.e. political parties do not take European elections as seriously as they take national elections, and often the election systems used to elect MEPs are closed-list election systems, i.e. as an MEP, I do not gain much of an advantage if I communicate with a wide audience. I'd sooner play the game internally within my own political party instead. And then, among the member states of the European Union, if the European Union is a success, the incentive is to present that as a national success. Right? So those are the kind of downsides in each of the European Union institutions. Let me illustrate each of those in turn. This is some examples from the Twitter account of the European Commissioner for Regional Affairs. Boring conference, boring conference, boring conference, and boring conference. That's not interesting Twitter content. This is the European Commissioner for Transport. In front of an EU flag, in front of an EU flag, in front of an EU flag. Right? These are people that are communicating because they think that they have to and that they need to populate a Twitter account with some content on an everyday basis. But I don't give a damn, ultimately, whether Violetta Bulc is meeting Mr. Markula, yeah? And probably most of you don't give a damn about that either. Maybe if you are Mr. Markula, you give a damn about that. But that is essentially politicians who think, hang on a minute, there are people on social media, I need to populate my channel with something, let's just post up a picture of what I'm doing in my everyday life, despite the fact, or my everyday political life, despite the fact that that's not particularly interesting or compelling for any of us. What does the European Parliament do? The European Parliament is immensely proud of being the most liked parliament anywhere on Facebook. It has more Facebook likes than any other parliament as an institution than any other parliament anywhere else. Right? The German parliament, the Bundestag, doesn't even have a Facebook page for the parliament as a whole. Right? Do these 2.5 million people that like the European Parliament's Facebook page, does that actually have an everyday impact on how people's perceptions of the European Parliament are changed? Do any of you actually like the European Parliament on Facebook? Any of you in this room, politics nerds here? Be honest. Anyone want to own up? No one does. Okay, I think it probably proves the point. Essentially, these are people who are basically dedicated, committed, pro-European people already, yeah, who like to feel good, and the European Parliament likes to feel good by being the most liked parliament anywhere on Facebook. But if you like an institution, right, is that really something you want to like say, yeah, I really like that institution? Well, actually, probably it's something a bit more with a little ideology to it than that would inspire people in digital communication, not just saying, I really like a democratic institution. So I'm not altogether convinced that this works. This makes a bunch of European bureaucrats feel good, but I'm not sure it's necessarily an effective use of money. And then what about at the national level? So if the European Union does something good, it is the member states of the European Union that want to take credit for it. So this is a British example. The British Conservative Party back last year were very happy. We've banned credit card charges, they said, in a big advertising campaign across social channels. They didn't actually. It was actually the EU that banned credit card charges, i.e. that kind of thing where you book a flight and you get to the final screen and it tells you have to pay £2.50 to use a Visa card for booking your flight. The EU passed a law to ban those extra charges, and then the British Conservative Party were trying to take credit for it. But of course they would. If the EU does something good, you claim it as a national credit. If the EU does something bad, then you blame the EU for it. Right? And the difficulty then is the European Union perhaps does not have the way and the means to explain to European citizens directly how that whole process works. Why does that not fully work? Or one of the reasons why that doesn't fully work is the election system in the European Union is also dysfunctional, or is, how can I put it, not adequately developed yet. And elections generally, or the threat of an election or an election campaign, forces politicians to communicate with their voters. So there's the classical definition of a functioning party political system and how that works in an election. The definition comes from the 1950s, from Schumpeter, or 40s even, sorry. Parties present programs, voters make an informed choice between competing parties, the successful party puts its program into practice, and the governing party is judged on its successes at the next election. Right? So if I can convince you that I've been doing a good job the last 5 years, you might vote for me again and I can carry on being in power. But if I've been useless and I haven't been able to communicate it to you, then I stand the danger of being kicked out. The problem is at the European Union level that although there are elections to the European Parliament, no voters go and vote in those elections based on the behaviour of the previous 5 years. So we have European elections, let's leave Brexit to one side for now, but we have European elections coming up in 27 European Union countries in May of this year. How many of those voters are going to go and vote in those European elections based on how politicians have been behaving in the European Parliament in the last 5 years? Very, very few. Which party even controls the European Parliament? Right? Most voters don't even know that. Right? It's essentially a kind of de facto grand coalition between the European People's Party on the right and the Party of European Socialists. But nevertheless, and even me as an EU nerd, even I struggle to be able to essentially go and vote in the European elections and make an accurate judgment on what is different in the European Parliament now as opposed to how it would have been if another party had won those elections 5 years previously. To give a little example of that, of how in everyday politics in the European Union, communications ability doesn't count, the predominant political force in the European Parliament, or in European politics in general, the mainstream centre-right, the European People's Party, took a decision in November of who its candidate would be to be president of the European Commission. And there were the two gentlemen on the right, were both in the running. It's the centre-right, so it had to be two blokes. Alexander Stubb and Manfred Weber. Alexander Stubb is an impeccable communicator. He is an absolute pro. He commands a major following across different social channels. He's very compelling on television. Weber is a boring Christian democratic, much more conservative than Stubb, a crank from Bavaria. So which was the one that won by 75% to 25%? Of course it was Weber, i.e. the one that had the poor communication skills, rather than the one that has the good communication skills. Why? It's because Weber has better allies within his party family than Stubb does. Stubb is more edgy, Stubb has more of his own ideas, he's harder to control. Ultimately, if I were to think of it with a kind of election campaigning hat on, they should go for Stubb. If I have my internal party machinery hat of keeping 6-year-old German Christian Democrats happy hat on, then it's obvious that they would go for Weber. Okay? So ultimately here, to decide one of the, well, is the odds on for who will be the Commission President will be Weber, someone whose digital communications abilities are not of a high quality, i.e. the decision was taken using, or based on incentives of which an ability to communicate is not a strong factor. Part of the difficulty as well is, even if you take it aside from elections, is the European Union institutions don't really know how to listen to what citizens tell them. Because European Union politics is also quite complicated. So Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the European Commission, keeps on saying, I want to put European citizens in the middle of the decision-making process, but without a concrete idea exactly how he'll do that. So, for example, he's done lots of citizen consultations, commissioners going out around the European Union and talking to people. And one of the most popular things that they came across was that the European Union should stop changing the clocks to summertime, right, or wintertime and summertime, right? So at the moment, the EU across every European Union country, the last Saturday of October and the last Saturday of March, you change the clocks, okay? And it's coordinated in the European Union. 4 million European citizens told the European Commission that they wanted to stop that and to not have that clock change any longer. Only for the European Union to discover it was actually a darn sight harder to do than they thought it was going to be, and it actually messes up all kinds of technology, it messes up airline schedules and all kinds of other things, and because they tried to do what they thought was popular among European citizens, they ultimately then let everyone down, and the ending the clocks changing proposal is going to have to be delayed by a full 2 years, despite the fact it's actually popular. okay? Because they haven't calculated the actual practical consequences enough. So even in the circumstances where the institutions want to listen and want to do two-way communications, then actually when you get into the technical nitty-gritty, it doesn't always even then work. Part of the difficulty is then my second point, is digital communication is hard if your political system can't adapt to it. So I'm going to start this bit with a quote from Angela Merkel. She said in 2013, Das Internet ist für uns alle Neuland. The internet is a new world for all of us, she said in 2013. And everyone said, come on, this is a bit ridiculous. Like, we've been using the internet for a good decade already. Like, and it's been a mainstream uptake for more than a decade. Why? Right? This is off. Like, Angela Merkel is clearly not a stupid person. She's indeed very intelligent and very effective. Why is she saying this? All right. Now, and at the same time, the gentlemen that run the two main EU institutions at that period, Juncker and Schulz has now subsequently moved off, were both proud owners of old Nokias, right, in 2013. Indeed, Juncker is still the proud owner of an old Nokia. I don't know what they're saying to each other in this picture, but like, look at the score I got on Snake or something while listening to your speech. The point is this. Those people at the highest level of our political institutions are among the most sheltered people in our societies from the changes the internet brings. All right? Angela Merkel is the same age as my father, a recently retired school geography teacher. The problem was for him, my father, was 10, 15 years ago, all the pupils he was teaching had Google and he didn't. I.e., they could get answers to questions faster than he could. And he had to learn, because he had no option as a school teacher. He had to learn. Right? Same as your other professors who are 60-something at Queen Mary University of London. But Angela Merkel doesn't have to learn. Angela Merkel can ask a member of staff to book a flight. She's never going to have to query the next time for a departure of a train at Mile End Tube Station. Right? She's got people that will do that for her. I had a situation with a British politician I was working with in 2007, didn't know how to do copy and paste in Windows, because they'd been sheltered from that, because they had staff to do it for them. Okay? And ultimately, this is not only an issue of the generation of the politician, she's relatively elderly, but as are Juncker and Schulz, but for example, a German case, the leader of my own political party, the German Greens, has just decided to delete his Twitter and Facebook accounts because he thinks he can, right? Because he's got a bit of a difficulty with the data protection policies of those networks. He's so far sheltered from the way that most of his voters live their everyday lives that he thinks he can get away with making a decision like that. Right? I think that's an extremely bad call. But ultimately, if you are schooled in those hierarchical organizations, particularly the hierarchy of a political party, that shelters you from the everyday changes that are brought about by the internet and social networking. Having started it in a negative way, let me give some examples where this stuff does work, however, where if you're clever, you can change the course of European Union politics by networking together online to force European Union institutions to change their behavior. One of the most interesting cases in EU digital campaigning is a case of a particular type of pesticides called neonicotinoids. This is a type of pesticide which some scientific studies show is behind the decrease in bee populations in Europe. When you've used this pesticide, the bees get disorientated, don't find their way back to the hives. The beehives collapse, and therefore your crops don't get pollinated. And if your crops don't get pollinated, your crops fail, and your agriculture fails. Right? So it's quite serious. And indeed, this particular type of pesticide is not intended to kill bees. That's how this impact. Back in 2013, there were 7 online petitions, each with a 5-figure number of signatures, directed at the European Commission to say, we expect from you a ban on neonicotinoid pesticides to stop this problem of beehive collapse. And contrary to what the industry wanted, the European Commission acted. It said, yeah, actually, in this case, at least for a temporary period of time, we will ban these pesticides to at least prove whether indeed the pesticides are the cause of the problem. Now, ultimately, the science got a bit mixed up, and you've ended up having a situation where the pesticides are now part allowed again. But essentially, the case was, on one side, massive grassroots networks of online activists, on the other side, business interests, and the politicians caught in between and being pressurised from both sides. And in this case, the European Commission acted on the side of the activists. Another one that was even better or even cleverer was a campaign called Hugh's Fish Fight. That was run by a British television chef called Hugh Fernley Whittingstall. He came and parked that old fishing boat outside the European Parliament. That's the Parliament building you can see behind there in the corner of the picture. And on his fishing boat it says, you can't ignore 676,000 people. And every time he signed a petition on his website, the number went up on the fishing boat. And every time the politicians went into the Parliament, past his fishing boat, they saw how many more people had signed his petition. He was trying to reach one person in the European Parliament with that campaign. It was the European Parliament's rapporteur on the fishing policy reform, a German politician called Ulrike Rodust. And when she then passed a greener fishing policy reform than anyone had expected, she said, we thought we could do this because we thought it was popular. Right? Take note of the slogan, however, and again, sorry, where the industry interests and indeed the national interest, the French fisheries minister was absolutely furious about it. But nevertheless, online direct action, grassroots networking to change European Union law. The next time British Eurosceptics tell you the EU institutions never listen, maybe cite Hugh's Fish Fight back at them. But it doesn't always work. A campaign, you might not be able to ignore 670,000 citizens, but you can ignore 1.8 million. This was a Christian campaign that wanted to end EU research money for stem cell research. Massive online mobilization in 2015, 1.8 million people saying no EU money for stem cell research, failed. Didn't make any headway. Why did it not make any headway? The timing was wrong, and there was strong interest on the other side, and the European Union said, we're not reforming our research and development money for that, so therefore, no. Okay? So it doesn't always work. Right? And what you've got to bear in mind then, also, if you are a campaigner in something like this, is how does the politician who is on the receiving end work out what is important? So one of the very few members of the European Parliament who absolutely nails this stuff is a Dutch liberal called Marietje Schaake from D66, Dutch Liberal Party. And she said to me, a couple of years back now, she said to me, I've received this week 20,000 emails about shark finning. That is, when you catch a shark, you take off its fin, you lob the shark back overboard dead, because those shark fins are a speciality in soups in East Asia. So Schaake says to me, what can I do as a politician with 20,000 emails about shark finning? I don't sit in a fisheries committee. I don't know, is 20,000 people, is it many or is it few? But what I've got is a lousy IT system in the European Parliament. I've got no way effectively of filtering all of that out. And basically my email has been unusable this week due to all of these emails about shark finning. Right? How do I act on that, ultimately? And so what we've got to think about in the EU, and you could say the same at the national level, is when politicians are faced with this onslaught, this mass of digital communications, how do you know how to act or what to act upon? And the challenge, as outlined by Clay Shirky, the internet theoretician, you are reducing the cost for participation all the time. We can put up a campaign about shark finning very cheaply, but the problem is there are so many of those campaigns, it therefore gets harder and harder for a politician to work out which ones they can act upon. Right? I.e., they've essentially got this problem, how do you separate the signal from the noise? And in a digital communications environment, it gets harder and harder with every passing day. So if you're thinking about designing a campaign, or if you're thinking as individual citizens, should I sign that petition, try and think who's going to be receiving it and what will the conclusions be, or the conclusions they can draw from it when they do receive that. Now let's draw the final part together. Digital communications is not without its purposes or without its advantages in European Union politics. If you ask yourself the question, is digital communication a way and means of following what's going on inside what is known as the Brussels bubble? The equivalent is the Westminster Village, or inside the Beltway would be what the Americans would call it. I.e., it often feels like your political system is talking to itself. I.e., politicians are talking to journalists, are talking to campaigners, and talking to consultants, but that communication they're having doesn't actually relate back down to the everyday general citizens on the ground. So is what Brussels is doing in digital communications, is it just talking to itself, or is it actually talking to a wide European mass public? So is it trying to do that, i.e. trying to reach mass, or is digital communications trying to do that, i.e. get a message in front of the eyes of, that's 4 members of the European Commission there gathered around an iPad. And ultimately then, when it then comes on to the practical everyday politics, Twitter is essentially the tool for doing that, i.e. getting a message in front of the eyeballs of a politician. Facebook, by contrast, largely has been the tool for doing that, i.e. doing mass. Okay. The challenge, and I haven't really got time to go into it in depth here, the difficulty is Facebook becomes less and less a good tool for doing mass digital communications post-Trump, essentially, because Facebook has adjusted its algorithm to mean that political communications, which are put out by political organisations or parties, go less far on Facebook these days than they did in the pre-Trump era. Basically, Facebook hasn't been able to stamp out fake news, and so therefore it's just essentially giving you less news, full stop. Okay? So the European Union institutions also fall victim to this, i.e. the total amount of eyeballs you get on your content. Even those 2.5 million people that like the European Parliament's page on Facebook, only a very low percentage of them are ever going to actually see anything that's written by the European Parliament. So then, let's come back to Twitter instead. Twitter remains the predominant social media communication channel for the everyday discussion about European Union politics. Every single member of the 28 members of the European Commission, every single one of them has a Twitter account. Some of them had to be dragged kicking and screaming onto Twitter. I know, for example, the Vice President Timmermans was not keen, but his staff were told him he had to. You will not find any national political system anywhere in Europe where you have every single government minister on Twitter, but in the European Union institutions, you have every single commissioner has a presence on that channel. In the European Parliament, it's also extremely high. It's 611 out of 751 MEPs, so 81% of members of the European Parliament have a Twitter account. So essentially, Twitter becomes the back channel for gossip and everyday breaking news in and around the Brussels European Union circle. Why? To a large extent due to one lady who was pretty good at it. I can't find any deep theoretical reasons for why this is. The person who showed how to do it was the former European Commissioner for Digital Affairs between 2009 and 2014, a Dutch Commissioner, Nelly Kroes, who was a politician who was 68 years of age when she took on the job, i.e. not a spring chicken, and ended up with a reasonably decent number of followers on Twitter, and managed to use it as a kind of mini campaigning tool to demonstrate how EU law had an impact on people's lives. So one of the most interesting things that she highlighted her thinking, she happened to be sat in Dusseldorf airport and said, they charge for Wi-Fi, this is thievery, she says. We pay huge charges for connectivity, £6 per hour. Right? Now, 95% of politicians I know would have just paid that €6 and paid it on the corporate credit card. Right? Kroes didn't, because she realised there was actually a serious problem to this. This became a minor scandal in the press. The head of communications of Dusseldorf Airport had to answer the questions why the Wi-Fi was so expensive. Dublin Airport won a prize then that was given out by Cruise for the best connected, best airport Wi-Fi. So they thought they were good, and Dusseldorf got critique. So she found a way and a means of using that tool to essentially make a point about how connectivity was actually going to be a useful thing for European citizens. And use Twitter as the tool of being able to connect a serious political issue with journalists and make a virtuous circle to drive the issue more widely. You also get political intelligence out of Twitter. This is an old story, but it's, he's no longer an MEP, Matthijs Gorter, but the story's good, so I keep it in my slides. This is a very public spat on Twitter between a centre-right politician from Finland, Airita Korhola, and Matthijs Gorter, who's a centre-left politician from Germany in the European Parliament. And these people are basically having an open fight about a legislative dossier, the reform of the EU's emissions trading scheme. Gorter has now a chance to show his collaborativeness, and then Gorter replies, in the first round he did negotiate, including a spelling error. I attended every meeting, I listened to the others, right? This is basically politicians having a very public spat, right? Now, I don't know if this is a good thing for the sake of their own careers, but if you follow this dossier, this is like gold dust, because this will tell you what's going to happen when it then comes to the vote in the European Parliament afterwards. Right? These tweets changed the carbon price in the emissions trading scheme, because ultimately you could then bet on what was going to happen, of which the reform was going to go. Right? So if you're a politics junkie and you need the everyday politics news, this is the type of behaviour that you're actually looking for. Individuals who themselves are using these channels and themselves have responsibility and are using Twitter as the way to communicate about that. And then in and around the European Union institutions, you have every other player imaginable in the Brussels political environment who has a Twitter account. You've got journalists, including Eurosceptic ones like Bruno Waterfield of The Times. You have trade associations like the European Consumers Association. And you've got senior people and lobbyists like Monique Goyens, who's the boss of the European Consumers Association. Just to kind of give a flavour of the types of people that you have. And you have a bunch of anonymous accounts and parody accounts that add a bit of life and intrigue and interest into the whole game of following European Union politics. So every potential political actor, including the spoofs and the jokes, is present there. All I would say as a kind of a word of caution is the populists in the European Parliament are better at this than the political mainstream is. If you look at the total number of seats in the European Parliament, which is the top part of the graph, and the bottom one is the total number of Twitter followers, you see that it is the populist left and the populist right that are overrepresented on Twitter in comparison to the total number of seats in the European Parliament. Probably because populist left messages and populist right-wing messages work better and more effectively across social media than measured, carefully thought out, politically centrist messages potentially do. Why does Twitter work, however, as a political tool among political professionals? It works because Twitter gives you a way to go flexibly from the quasi-private up to the entirely global and back down again in a way that Facebook as a tool doesn't allow you, right? Let me just explain that using a very local example. When I last lived in London, I lived just the other side of Mile End Station from here, so this was my neighbourhood. And in 2012, there were riots. 2011, 2012, lose track of the dates. 2011, there were riots in London. And I needed a way from Bow to Camden by bicycle, avoiding the riots. Right? That was an ungoogleable question. How do I solve it? I solve it on Twitter. I put out the question on Twitter, does anyone know a way from Bow to Camden avoiding #UK riots? Two complete strangers say to me, take the route along the canal, it's safe, try that. Now, do I trust complete strangers? I don't know, but we had the same interest at that particular moment. I tried it, it worked. I thanked those people, and that was the only communication we ever had. And where those people are today, I don't know. It's gone. Right? So what Twitter could do is form a community among those people in the moment we needed it, but a week later we didn't need it and the community fell apart again. Now, where was the debate about the riots on Facebook? There was one, but you couldn't stitch it all together. Right? There were friends of mine that were living in London who were talking about the riots, but in order to answer a question like that on Facebook, I would have to have a friend who lived in that neighbourhood. On Twitter, the chances of finding a complete stranger who had the same interest as me in that particular moment, was considerably higher. Or if we apply that kind of mechanism to European Union politics, right? I deal a lot with environmental policy, but what is on the agenda each day of European Union politics depends on the day, right? We might be talking about climate change, or we might be talking about Dieselgate, or we're talking about recycling. Twitter allows you in a flexible way to find the political professionals who are talking about that at that particular moment, because the network is open and publicly searchable. Where is the debate about climate change on Facebook? The answer is there's lots of it, but not in a way that you can systematize. I.e., you can't actually find everything that every MEP or everything that every commissioner says about climate change very easily on Facebook. That's the reason the very publicness or the very searchability of it is also part of the reason why Twitter in the end becomes such an indispensable political tool for everyday conversations about the European Union. Okay? Right, I've got one super quick case study to explain just the story of how some of this works, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. This case study involves the European Commissioner and Schengen, so the EU's border-free zone. So, any of you that happen to have encountered me or followed me on social media or on Twitter before will see that I travel a lot by train because I'm politically green and I go out of my way to make sure I don't fly. So I was on a TGV train going from Paris to Milan in the pre-refugee crisis era, and and the whole train was asked to show their passports on the French side of the border between Saint-Jean-de-Maurienne and Modane, which at that stage was illegal because Schengen meant there were not supposed to be border controls happening. So French police come through the train, I speak French, I also know the law of Schengen, and so I have an argument with a police officer saying, actually in French, do you really think you should be stopping me and asking me this? And isn't this against Article 21 of the Schengen Borders Code? I was really the wrong person to stop. The European Commissioner at that stage was Cecilia Malmström, now the Trade Commissioner, previously the Home Affairs Commissioner. And so I write to Cecilia Malmström on Twitter. So there's the tweet, French police systematically not respecting Schengen, blog entry with a transcript from the border. I'll leave you to work out how I got a transcript. Thanks, we'll have a look at this, went back from Greece. She happened to be in Greece on the day, the Greece thing is incidental. A week later, I get an email into my inbox, Dear Mr. Worth, we see that you have been tweeting the Commissioner about Schengen. I am the director in the Commission responsible for Schengen. The next time you're in Brussels, would you like to meet us for a cup of coffee? Okay. It's like, what do they want? Are they going to basically tell me to shut up? The answer ultimately was completely the opposite. What they said was, we know these controls are happening, but we don't know where. What can you do as a blogger, Twitter nerd, to help us work out where the controls are? So out of that came a whole website. Now this doesn't work anymore because as a result of what happened then with the refugee crisis meant a lot of stuff broke in Schengen anyway, so it doesn't fully function. But what we did is based on one tweet exchange with a commissioner, an email that followed up, a whole mini campaign was built out of that. Right? Now, I have not, as a citizen, right, an individual European, got any other way other than Twitter of getting a message in front of the eyes of a high-level politician. I have no other way. I email them, staff will filter out. On Facebook, I've got no idea if it's them. I don't live in Brussels, so going to an event where that politician is speaking is actually quite hard and actually very time intensive. But if I know that that politician is themselves tweeting, and there is a chance that that will then land on the screen in front of them, that gives me, as an individual European, quite a lot of power. And if I'm Cecilia Malmström, where what I'm told actually matches my own agenda, now Cecilia Malmström is a liberal and likes Schengen, right? I like Schengen, we both want Schengen to work, and we've got convenient communication where the blogger plus the commissioner has the same interest, Twitter gives us a way and means of making sure we can act on that. So, those are all the images I've used. I'm a big fan of Creative Commons image licensing, so that's my legal slide. So just to recap what I've covered, why bother with digital communication in the EU? It's complicated. It's very hard to do that in a political system that's hierarchical and old-fashioned and with people who are sheltered from the impacts of digital politics at the top of it. And then ultimately, probably via Twitter, gossip and debate inside the Brussels bubble is what's interesting in digital communication. The mass reaching out is still to a greater extent done on Facebook, and even Facebook's impact is perhaps decreasing. So that's all for my intro. Now it's over to you for any of your questions or remarks. And I'll just actually move the slide on so you then have the contact details. So anything you want to know about practical experience or any of those things, now's the time to ask. No questions. There's no such thing as a silly question. Go for it.
It's not particularly about your experiences, but your experience as a European and traveling Europe. What do you think? What sort of implications can Brexit have on universities in the UK and across Europe?
Oh, okay. Right. I fear for it at a couple of levels. First of all, Britain's participation in Erasmus in the future is not guaranteed. So the opportunities that I had, right, I'm 38, so I'm 15 years, a bit more older than you. So the opportunities I had, I was like kind of really in the middle of the kind of Erasmus boom generation, if you like. I fear that Brexit will have the impact that it will limit, maybe not you, because you're just doing it maybe soon enough, but those people that are 2 or 3 years younger than you, and it may limit those people's opportunities. And I worry about that. Maybe sometime medium term, you might find British-European exchange systems that can partly make up for it. But the fact that you can do it en masse in the way that Erasmus allowed it, I fear what will happen there. The second is then also what happens to research and development in or research projects between British universities and other European universities. And those research projects are essentially the British universities are being pushed out of them and marginalised from them. Now, some British universities, I don't know if Queen Mary has done this, but some British universities have set up affiliate organisations in other European countries so as to mean they can still profit from EU money. So you have like the University of Kent's Brussels campus, which will allow them via that route to keep British students into that loop. So I fear for what that's going to mean medium term. I think it also ties in to a certain extent to the British population's reticence about going and exploring other European countries. There have always been far more Erasmus students that have come to the UK than there have been British students that have gone on Erasmus to other European countries. And so I must say, I, without going into the individual detail, I don't run individual projects in that regard. I'm fearful. What I must say, however, is most of those problems could be resolved if there was a political incentive to do so. Right? Like, you could set up those research projects, right? You'd have to reinvent a project to just keep doing what you've been doing already. But I see very, very little incentive on behalf of the UK politicians, particularly in the Conservative Party, to really do that. I know that, for example, the British Foreign Office and the British Council have both been ploughing quite a lot of money into that question, short term, to try to manage to make sure that kind of academic collaboration doesn't just go off a cliff when Britain leaves the European Union. But ultimately, it's going to ultimately need high-level political buy-in in Westminster, and I don't think that there is that at the moment, bearing in mind the very kind of inward-looking nature of May's Brexit strategy, I'm afraid. So I'm nervous. Go for it.
The question is about Schengen, right? Because she said that it doesn't work in quite the same way anymore, like in terms of whether or not you're breaking Schengen by doing. But I know, for instance, that they're doing extensive checks of all foreign cars for a number of places, the Danish-German border,
Yeah.
the Danish police and military.
Yeah, because they are actually at the moment legally allowed to do that. So one of the things that actually happened, I didn't have it in the slide, so yes, but they're legally allowed to do it. Because there was actually, the conclusion after all of this thing with Cecilia Malmström was, I'm just going to find the page, was transparency of where the border controls were legally allowed to happen. Wait, I'm just going to find that page for you. Here we go. Wait, let me just bring this page up. So you can now find a page on the European Commission's website about which countries have a Schengen suspension, and you'll find on it Denmark, here you go, that has the temporary Schengen suspension until the 11th of May 2019. So therefore, the whole future of Schengen ultimately is in question as a result of that. Much of that, now actually I do think they actually are systematically checking that border. There are other borders where it's done more as a kind of lip service to security to appease the populations. So when France reintroduced, you see France has got a suspension here somewhere, yeah, at the bottom there. The border between Luxembourg and France, there are 40 roads crossing that border, yeah, including only one motorway. Which is the one that has the checks on it? The motorway. Leaving 39 roads without checks. Which is the one that most people see? The motorway. Right? If you want to go across the Austrian-German border, you don't go on the motorway at Freising. Anyway, takes to Salzburg on the German side. Go on a country road and you'll never see a policeman. The Danish-German border has fewer roads, and they do systematically control pretty much all of them. Right? So ultimately, the kind of move to right-wing authoritarian approaches to borders and border controls is a trend in the European Union, but at least we now know where those are. Right? So it therefore means if you're crossing a border other than those ones, it still is supposed to work. So I just recently crossed the French-Italian border at Ventimiglia, the Mediterranean coast. That actually worked, somewhat to my surprise. So it does still work in certain places. And I probably crossed the German-Belgian border at Aachen probably 300 times or something. I've once seen a policeman there in that period. So it's not broken everywhere. But the Danish border, unfortunately, you've not got a legal leg to stand on to make a complaint about that because they've got an exemption.
Well, then they're not checking the trains and they're not checking Danish normal places. So.
Right, no, but they do check. They every time I've crossed it, I used to live in Copenhagen. Every time I've crossed it on the train recently, it's been checked too. I don't know if they do every train, but they do check a large proportion of them too. Yes?
When it comes to like trying to find younger voters, people tend to switch between social media sites a lot. Like, a lot of young people have left Facebook, they're on Twitter, they eventually going to leave Twitter, and some other social media sites up. How slowly do you think politicians adapt to it? Like in a few years now, are they going to try and use that on Snapchat? As they discover Snapchat exists?
Yeah, well, they do, or they've tried, right? Corbyn has tried quite a lot of investing time on Snapchat. The Austrian Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, is really big on Instagram, whatever. The ultimate issue, I think, is we're going to reach some stage where it's going to calm down. Or at least we know. I think you need to ask yourself the question, what type of content have you got as a politician, right? Politicians have got plenty of text. They might have a bit of video of them talking. They've not got very compelling visuals. They're not funny, mostly, right? And you ultimately, bearing in mind that content they have available to them, which platforms does that work on, ultimately? So, for example, the Dutch presidency of the Council of the EU went on Instagram, and it was a disaster because all they basically had was boring pictures of boring conference rooms of boring people talking, and it didn't make a good Instagram account. So the basic rule should be is only go onto a channel if you've got the adequate content to reach people there, ultimately. Don't go, this channel's booming, but hang on a minute, I haven't actually got the right technique in order to be able to do it. So that's the first question. What you also got to remember is most politicians have got relatively little in the way of resources and time. So a standard member of parliament has probably got 2 or 3 researchers who've got to deal with all the research, the constituency business, the communications, the social media, and so on. Only if you're a really high-level politician, a minister, a prime minister, something like that, Have you got adequate resources to manage to have a strategy that goes across all of the channels? So ultimately, you do see some politicians moving from channel to channel, but that therefore means ultimately, I think they're probably making sometimes the wrong call. Yeah? I'm also a bit nervous about reusing the same content automatically across multiple channels. So some politicians have experimented with it, but ultimately I think the core dynamic of Twitter, a neutral network, you follow people rather than friending them or liking them, heavily text-based, very quick messages, breaking news, and a kind of predictability about what you see because it's not very algorithmically filtered. I think that therefore is why Twitter lends itself so heavily to at least professional political communication. The challenge is generally across all of these networks is if you want to reach people directly, how do you do it, right? Because Facebook's reach is decreasing unless you pay for ads. Twitter, only a small part of Twitter is actually committed to politics, right? Like football players have got massively bigger followings on Twitter than politicians have got. Politicians have got no images to use on Instagram. They're not compelling enough to adequately use Snapchat. I'm not going to give my mobile number to a politician to allow that person to message me intrusively using a messenger app, right? Apply all of that across the board and you end up having a problem. You're basically going, hang on a minute, how am I going to reach them, right? And all of our politicians in Britain, in Germany, and at a European Union level are to a certain extent going through that. What does still work, however, is the multiplier effect. Can I reach someone who themselves has got a bigger audience, i.e. can I reach a journalist, or can I reach a celebrity of some sort, right? If I'm talking about Brexit, can I reach Gary Lineker, who will retweet my stuff? So if you can try and do that, again, Twitter has a strong multiplier effect, so I can then shape things in the mainstream media that way. So basically, I think my answer to your question is, I agree with you that that's an issue and a challenge, and very few politicians have got that right, other than the ones who've got so much in the way of resources, they can cover all of those channels.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, John, for coming, sharing your advice on digital content. And don't hesitate to continue the conversation, tweeting John, and also coming to the seminar with an example of a politician or image or anything that you want to talk about regarding social media for next week. Yeah? Thank you.
I'm just checking. I've got time now. Well, unless someone else is coming in for a lecture immediately now. Okay, let me pack up my stuff, but then I can happily chat in the corridor outside of the lecture theatre. Yeah, Toby, you do that, but I have time, so I'm good. So my next. Yeah, but I did like incredible. The answer is by ridiculous love, unfortunately. Because the MP I work for, who is sitting in budget committee and leading a German speech. And I happened to just one love send lectures to all the MPs at the right moment, and it happened to land on the right table at the right time. And so it was ridiculous coincidence. So the answer ought to be, this worries me somewhat in terms of principle behind it. Ultimately, most of those things are given out a party vote. I.e., if you spent time as a member of a party, you will know some of the right people who can put you in touch with people who will allow you to get a way in. That's how most of those decisions are. Yeah, so mine was right. I was a member of the party, but didn't actually make any decisions which was spoke German. But that was odd because Germany is not a central language in the European Parliament. It just so happened that this MEP was in Budgets Committee and at that moment needed a German speaker. What I would say is make sure if you ever get one of those, make sure you've spoken to someone who's worked very closely with that MEP before you go. Because the MEP I worked for was really quite a disaster. problem, for example, and would fall asleep in committee meetings, and other MEPs would laugh. You don't want to be working for a boss who is not taken seriously by their colleagues. So just make sure, you're welcome to tweet me or email me going, I've got an internship offer from this MEP, do you know if they're any good? Right, as a human, right, I'm not making a political judgment there, but if you're working closely with a politician, it's really important that you've got to be able to respect them, right, as a person, maybe as a politician too, but at least like you go, you're at least a decent human, or you're like at least a decent boss, or a friendly character. But unfortunately, most of those jobs are given out to people in the party. Sorry. But better I'd be honest about it. Have no illusion. Right. I'm just packing my stuff. I'm by all means fire away the question.
That's what I got my seminar right now. I was thinking about like basically